My ex-wife stood up at the harvest supper, put her hand on my arm like we were still friends, and told 90 people she had set me up with Nell Harrow, the ugliest woman in town. The whole hall laughed. My name is Owen Ashby. 2 years ago I owned the best breeding stable in Ashcombe. That night I was wearing a borrowed coat, sitting at the end of a table nobody wanted, and my ex-wife Cecily was 3 weeks from marrying a solicitor with a carriage and a name that opened doors. She said she meant it kindly. She said we'd suit. Neither of us had anything left to lose. But then I heard a cup set down at the end of the third table, and I turned and there she was. Gray dress, collar open, the burn scar running from her jaw down into her shoulder, in full view of every single person who had just laughed at her. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She put on her shawl, slow as Sunday, and walked the whole length of that hall to the door, like she was leaving a room she'd already outgrown. 90 people looked away from her. I never stopped looking. I followed her into the yard to apologize for a room I hadn't spoken for, and she wouldn't let me. "Don't," she said. "If you apologize, I'll have to be gracious, and I'm very tired." I asked if I could call on her properly. She asked if I was using her to prove something to my ex-wife. I said yes, and she said, "Well, that's honest, at least. 3 visits. That was the deal. That was all she'd give me." But nobody in Ashcombe knew who she really was. Not the shopkeepers who shortchanged her. Not my ex-wife who made her the punchline. Not me. Not for a long, long time. So why did a woman with a duke's blood in her veins agree to sit at that table and be laughed at? What was she running from that was worse than an entire town calling her ugly to her face? And when the black carriage with the crest on the door finally rolled into Ashcombe looking for a lost daughter, why was the one thing I did next the one thing she could never forgive? Let me take you back to that hall. It smelled of wet wool and roast mutton and tallow smoke, and the windows had gone black with the early dark. Yorkshire, autumn, 1818. Every farmer in the valley was packed in shoulder to shoulder, and the long tables ran the length of the corn hall, with the good families at the top and the rest of us sliding down toward the door, like water finds the low ground. I sat at the bottom. That's not a figure of speech. That's exactly where they put me. 2 years earlier, I'd have been at the top table with my hand around a glass and men leaning in to ask me about bloodlines. I bred horses. Good ones. The best in the North Riding, and I'd say that plain, because it was true, and because it's the last true thing I had. Then came the year without a summer. The sky went the color of a dirty coin, and stayed that way. And the corn rotted standing up, and hay went to 6 pounds a load. My father-in-law offered to buy in. Save the stable. Keep it in the family. I told him I'd not be kept. I want you to understand how small those 5 words were, and how much they cost. I said them in a warm room with my wife standing right there, and I felt tall saying them. 6 months later, the bailiffs walked my mares out of my own yard, one at a time, and I stood at the fence and counted them going. And Cecily stood behind me at the kitchen window and didn't come out. She stayed another year. I'll give her that. But by then I couldn't look at her, because looking at her meant seeing what I'd cost her, and a man can only fail to look at his wife for so long before she goes and finds somebody who will. And here's the part I've never said aloud to anyone. The night she left, I stood in that empty house, and under all the grief and the shame and the roaring in my ears, there was relief. A small, clean, quiet feeling, like taking off a wet coat. I have never forgiven myself for that. Not once. Not in 2 years. So when Cecily rose at the harvest supper with her cheeks pink from the wine and her ring catching the candlelight and put her hand on my sleeve and said, "I've found him a match. Nell Harrow, kindest heart in the county, and I say it fondly, truly, the ugliest woman in Ashcombe. They'll suit. Neither of them has anything left to lose." I didn't stand up. I didn't defend anybody. I sat there in my borrowed coat and let it happen, because that's what I'd become. Then that cup went down on the wood. Not slammed, set, careful, like a woman putting down something she didn't want to break. And she walked out, and 90 people found something fascinating in the bottom of their glasses. I went after her because I couldn't stand the room. That's the honest reason. Not chivalry. The yard was cold and the puddles had a skin of ice on them, and she was standing by the wall pulling her shawl straight, and when she heard my boots, she said, without turning, "If you've come to be kind, don't." I've come to apologize. For what? You didn't laugh. A beat. I was watching. You were the only one. That knocked something loose in me. I said the next thing before I'd thought it through, that I'd like to call on her. Properly. Let the town see the joke didn't land. She turned round then, and looked at me for a long time. The light from the hall window fell across the left side of her face, and I saw the scar clear, pale and ridged, running up from under her collar along her jaw, and her left hand, where 2 fingers had healed, curled together like a bird's foot. She didn't cover any of it. That's the thing that stayed with me. She stood there and let me see, and waited to see what my face would do. You want to use me, she said, to prove something to your wife. Yes. She blinked. Just once. Well, that's honest at least. She pulled her shawl tight. 3 visits. Then you've had your proof, and I've had my quiet. And we're square. Wicker's End sat a mile and a half out on the Kirkby Road, at the bottom of a lane so rutted my one remaining horse had to pick her way like an old woman on ice. There was a cottage with a sagging thatch, an orchard gone half wild, and 14 white beehives standing in a row along the south wall like little chapels. And the smell. God, the smell. Beeswax and rosemary and wood smoke, and under it the sweet, heavy breath of honey, warming in a pan. I've smelled a lot of things in my life. I have never smelled anything better than that lane in the morning. We sat either side of her kitchen table with 2 cups of tea going cold between us, and neither of us knew what we were doing there. She asked after my stable, and I said I hadn't got one, and she said she knew, and I said then why ask, and she said because it's what people say. I left after 40 minutes. Rode home furious with myself, and couldn't work out why. The second visit, she was in the orchard when I came up the lane, and she didn't stop what she was doing. She just said, if you're stopping, hold this, and put a smoker in my hand. A tin thing like a little kettle with bellows on the side, breathing cold white smoke. I don't know how. Pump it. Slow, like breathing. So I stood in an orchard in a borrowed coat, pumping smoke at 14,000 bees, while a woman, the whole town called ugly, lifted the lid off their house with her bare hands, and I watched her work. That's when it started. I want to be exact about this, because people always want the moment to be grand, and it never is. Her right hand held the knife. Her left, the ruined one, the one that couldn't straighten, she braced against the comb frame to hold it steady, and she did it without thinking about it, without hiding it, the way you'd use a tool you'd had all your life. Wax curling up off the blade, honey running slow and gold down into the pail, the bees crawling over her wrists and her not flinching once. A bee got inside my cuff and stung me, and I swore so loud a blackbird came out of the hedge. She laughed. And here's what I saw, and what I'd see 100 times after. Half a second before she laughed, her eyes went round the yard, checking who was there, checking whether it was safe to be happy in front of them. That woman had to check the room before she was allowed to laugh. Something in my chest went very quiet and very still, and it has never gone back to how it was before. The third visit, I stayed past the hour. Neither of us mentioned it. She put bread and honey in front of me, and I ate it standing at her window looking at the hives, and she said, "You're using up your last visit slowly." I'm aware. She said, and poured more tea. But it was that day I saw the ledger. It was open on the dresser, and I'm not proud that I read it, but I've a farmer's eye, and it went to the numbers before I could stop it. Wax sales, honey by the pound, salves and balms, small money, careful money, and at the bottom of the page, underlined twice, lease, Michaelmas, M. Vaunce, Marcus Vaunce, Cecily's father, the man who'd offered to save my stable and been told he'd not be permitted to. He owned the ground under her feet, the orchard, the cottage, the lane. Every one of those 14 hives sat on Vaunce land, and the lease was up in 11 weeks. I looked up, and she was watching me read it, and neither of us said a word, and that silence told me the whole reason she'd sat at that table on harvest night and let a room full of people laugh at her. She hadn't come for a husband. She'd come because Vaunce's daughter had asked her to, and when the man who owns your roof asks a favor through his daughter, you put on your gray dress and you go. I rode home with my jaw aching from clenching it. Now here's where my life turned. And it didn't turn on a ballroom or a letter or a duke. It turned on a horse. I had exactly one thing left in the world worth money: a commission. A 2-year-old bay colt belonging to a corn merchant in Thirsk, sent to me to be broken, 12 guineas on delivery. 12 guineas was rent, coal, and boots. 12 guineas was another 6 months of being a man with an occupation instead of a man with a past. And I could not break him. 3 weeks I'd had him. He wouldn't take the bit. He wouldn't stand at the mounting block. He'd go quiet as a lamb and then explode sideways with no warning at all, eyes rolling white. And once he came down so close to my head that I felt the wind of the hoof on my ear. Every trainer in the valley would have told you the same thing. Bad blood, bad temper, sell him for what he'll fetch. I'd started to believe it. I'd started to think that if I couldn't fix a horse, the one single thing I'd ever been good at, then Cecily had been right to go, and the town had been right to move me down to the bottom table, and every quiet thing I suspected about myself was true. Nell came up my lane on a Thursday with a jar of salve for the sting on my wrist. She hadn't been invited. I hadn't asked. She just came, and she stood at the rail of my little paddock and watched me fight that colt for 10 minutes without saying one word. I finally threw the rope down. Go on, say it. Say what? That he's ruined. She tilted her head. Walk him toward me. From his right side. He's worse on the right. Do it anyway. So I did. And the colt came, ears flicking, sweat foaming along his neck. And Nell put her left hand out. The ruined one. Fingers first, curled and pale and steady. The colt stopped dead, blew hard through his nose, and put his head down into her palm. I couldn't speak. He's deaf on the left, she said quietly. Watch him. He turns his whole body to hear you. He's not wild, Mr. Ashby. He's terrified of everything he can't hear coming. You've been standing on his deaf side and appearing out of nothing for 3 weeks, like a ghost. Any creature alive would fight you. I stood in my own paddock with my hands hanging at my sides. How did you know that? She stroked the colt's cheek with the back of her curled fingers. Because I know what it's like, she said, to have people talk about you on a side you can't hear. I'd like to tell you I said something worthy of that. I didn't. I stood there in the cold with my throat closed and thought a thought that frightened me more than the bailiffs ever had. For 2 years I've wanted my old life back. This is the first time in 2 years I've wanted to be a better man instead. We worked that colt together till the light went, approaching from the right, hand flat, voice low and constant, so he always knew where I was. By dusk he stood for the bit, trembling, but he stood. And when Nell finally turned to go, she stopped at my gate and said, not looking at me, "Your 3 visits are used up. That was mine, so it doesn't count. But I'd not build anything on me, Mr. Ashby. People do. And then Michaelmas comes, and I'm the one still standing in the lane." She walked off down the road in the last of the light. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in a cold house, listening to that colt move about in the barn, and I did the sum I'd been avoiding for a week. I hadn't thought about Cecily in 4 days. Not once. Not when I passed the church where we married. Not when I saw her carriage on the Kirkby Road. 4 days of nothing. And I hadn't even noticed the not thinking until I went looking for it. 2 years of a wound that wouldn't close, and it had started to knit shut in an orchard that smelled of wax and rosemary, held together by a woman with a scar on her throat and 14,000 bees. But there were 11 weeks till Michaelmas. And Marcus Vaughn's, who had never in his life forgiven a man for turning down his money, had already begun to hear that Owen Ashby was riding the Kirkby Road 3 times a week. He would send for me before the month was out. He would sit me down in a warm room, and he would put my whole old life on the table in writing. The farm, the stable, the debt wiped clean, and ask for one small thing in exchange. And on the same morning, a black carriage with a crest on the door would come up the Great North Road and stop in the yard of the Ashcombe Inn, carrying a gray, exhausted man who had been searching for 3 years, and who was carrying a small painted portrait of a young woman with no scar at all. The town noticed before I did. That's how these places work. You can be alone in a field with a woman and think nobody in the world can see you, but somebody's brother-in-law was on the ridge with a dog, and by Sunday it's in the pews. The first sign came at Ashcombe Market. I was buying nails. Nell was 3 people ahead of me at Boothroyd's counter, buying muslin for straining honey, and she put down a shilling and Boothroyd gave her back 4 pence. It should have been 7 pence. I knew it, because I'd bought the same muslin in the spring. She knew it too. I watched her look at those 4 pennies in her palm. I watched her decide. And then she closed her hand and said thank you, and walked out. I said nothing. I want you to sit in that with me a moment, because I've sat in it for the rest of my life. I stood in a shop with a hammer's worth of nails in my fist, and let a man rob a woman in front of me, because he was a churchwarden and I was a bankrupt, and because some rotten little voice in me said, "Not your business, you've enough trouble." I rode home behind her at a distance so she wouldn't see me. That's the kind of coward I was that day. The next market day I went back. The shop was full. 6 women in the queue. The smell of tallow and dust and dried lavender. I put my 7 pence on the counter and said, loud enough for the back of the room, "Mr. Boothroyd, muslin honey weight, same as you sold Miss Harrow on the 10th, and I'll thank you to count out my change on the wood, where we can all see it." The shop went dead quiet. He looked at me with pure hate. Then he counted it out, coin by coin, and every one of those coins hitting the counter sounded like a nail going in. I walked out into the sunshine, and I felt, for the first time in 2 years, like a man of some size. I also knew exactly what I'd done. Boothroyd bought his stock on credit. His credit came from the bank at Thirsk, and the bank at Thirsk had a director called Marcus Vaughn's. Word travels fastest downhill toward money. I went out to Wicker's End that afternoon, and she was in the orchard with the smoker going, and she didn't say good morning. She said, "You made a scene in Boothroyd's." I did. Don't. He robbed you. He's robbed me for 3 years. He'll rob me for 30 more, and I'll go on paying it, because the alternative is having no shop. She set the smoker down hard. "You think you defended me. You spent my credit to feel better about yourself." That landed like a hoof. "Nell, why do you come here?" She turned round, and there was something raw in her face I hadn't seen before. "Your 3 visits are gone. Your wife's got her joke. The town's had its laugh. It's finished. So why do you keep coming up my lane?" And I stood there and gave her the worst answer a man can give a woman. "I don't know." She nodded slowly, like she'd expected it, and hoped anyway. "Then stop," she said. "Not knowing is how people get hurt, and I am always the one who gets hurt." She went inside and shut the door. I rode home in the rain, and I got as far as the crossroads at Kirkby, and I sat there on that horse in the wet for a long time. Then I turned round and went back. I don't know how long I stood knocking, long enough for the water to come through the shoulders of that borrowed coat, and when she finally opened the door, she looked at me standing there, dripping on her step, and said, "Tired? You're an idiot." "I am. I've a fire lit. Don't say anything clever." Her kitchen was warm and dark, and smelled of wood smoke and wax. She hung my coat on the back of the door. She gave me a cup of something hot with honey in it, and we sat either side of the fire while the rain came down the chimney and hissed, and neither of us said anything for a long while. Then she said, "Ask me." "You've been not asking for 6 weeks, and it's louder than asking." So I asked, "How did it happen?" She looked into the fire. "There was a lodge," she said. "My family kept it for the shooting. Timber and thatch, 300 years old, and everyone said it would burn one day, and one day it did." She turned her cup slowly in her hands. "It was February. I was in the yard. I saw the smoke come out under the eaves, and I remember thinking, that's odd, like it was somebody else's house. Was anyone?" "My brother." She said it flat. "Ambrose. He was 9. The fire cracked." She didn't blink. "He was on the top floor. Everyone was outside shouting, and nobody was going in, because the stair was gone, and grown men stood in that yard and shouted." Her voice went hard on the word. "So I went in through the kitchen. There's a back stair for the servants. I got up 2 flights and I could hear him. Above me. Calling." She stopped. "And then I couldn't hear him. I didn't move. A beam came down across the passage. Burning. And I put my hands on it." She held up the left hand. The curled fingers, pale and shining in the firelight. "I don't remember deciding to. I remember the sound it made. And I remember thinking, quite calmly, this is going to be very bad. And then the smoke took my legs, and I came down the stair backwards, and someone dragged me out through the kitchen door." She set her cup down. "I came out alone. The rain filled up the silence. My father was in the yard when they brought me out, and he made a sound. Her mouth moved, not quite a smile. People think grief. It wasn't grief. I've heard him grieve. It was disappointment. She looked up at me then, straight at me, full in the firelight, the scar bright along her jaw, and I understood exactly what she was doing. She was waiting for me to flinch. Every person she had told this to had flinched, looked at the fire, looked at their hands, looked anywhere but the thing she was showing them, and every one of those looks had said the same thing: you should not have come out alone. I didn't look away. I said, "What was his name again?" She went completely still. "Ambrose," she said. "Tell me about him." And she had to put her hand over her mouth for a second before she could. Then she talked for an hour. About a 9-year-old boy who collected birds' eggs and labeled them wrong on purpose to annoy his tutor, who couldn't whistle and practiced every day, who was frightened of geese, who called her Nen because he couldn't say her name properly as a baby, and then kept it out of pure stubbornness for 9 years. She laughed twice while she talked. And both times, I watched, she checked the room first. At some point deep in that night she said, "My family are in the north. They're not people who bend. That's all I'll say, and I'd ask you not to press." And I didn't press. I want you to remember that. I didn't press, because she'd given me something bleeding and honest, and I wasn't going to ask her for the rest like it was owed. That restraint was the best thing I did in my whole life. It was also the thing that ruined us. I left at first light. The rain had stopped and the road was silver and the hedges were dripping, and I was so full of feeling I could hardly hold the reins. And as I came past the Ashcombe Inn, I saw a carriage in the yard. Black, mud to the axles. 4 horses being walked cool by a boy who'd clearly been dragged out of bed. And on the door, a crest. Proper heraldry. Gold on black. The kind you see on a church monument, and nowhere else in a town like ours. I remember thinking, somebody important has broken down. That was Tuesday. On Thursday, a boy came up my lane with a note. 2 lines, in a clerk's hand. "Mr. Vance will see you at 11 o'clock Friday. Mr. Vance suggests you come." Not requests, suggests. Vance's house sat above the town with the good windows facing the valley. And I hadn't been through that door since the day I told the man I'd not be kept. He'd aged. Heavier round the jaw. But the eyes were the same. Patient, cold, adding you up. He didn't offer me a chair for the first minute. Then he did, which was worse. "You've been seen," he said, "on the Kirkby Road. I've been breaking a colt." "Don't," he smiled, without any warmth at all. "My daughter marries in 3 weeks. Do you know what people are saying? That Owen Ashby's courting the Harrow woman, and that it's Cecily's doing, and that Cecily's a cruel piece of work who made a joke and it went sour on her. They're saying that because it's true. It doesn't matter whether it's true." He leaned forward. "It matters that the town has decided to feel sorry for you. And every drop of pity that lands on you splashes on my daughter." Then he opened a drawer. He put a folded paper on the table between us and turned it round so I could read it, and slid it across, and I looked down. It was a deed of conveyance. Ashby Farm, 14 acres, the paddocks, the long barn, the house my grandfather built, bought out of the bank's hands and made over to me, clear, and underneath it, a second sheet, the outstanding debt, every penny I'd owed for 2 years, the number I saw when I closed my eyes at night, marked discharged. My hands went cold. I had wanted this so badly and for so long that I had dreamed it. Actually dreamed it, and woken up crying, at 33 years of age, in an empty house. "It's yours," Vance said quietly. "Signed and witnessed by noon. For what? You'll end it with the Harrow woman. Today, cleanly. No letters, no lingering, you simply stop going." He sat back. "And her lease at Michaelmas is a separate matter, which I'll consider on its merits." I looked at that paper for a long time. Here's what nobody understands about a moment like that. It isn't a fight between good and bad. It's quieter and much worse than that. It's a soft, warm voice inside your own skull saying you could have your whole life back, and she'd be all right. She's always been all right. She's the strongest person you know. I sat in that chair, and I listened to that voice make its case. Then I thought about a woman in an orchard checking a yard to see if she was allowed to laugh. "May I borrow your pen?" I said. He slid it over, and something moved in his face. satisfaction. Quick and ugly. I picked it up. I looked at the nib. I set it back down on the table without touching the paper. "You've made a mistake, sir." "I beg your pardon?" "You've offered me my old life." I stood up. "I've been trying to give that life away for 6 weeks, and nobody will take it off me. It's not worth what you think. It cost me my wife, and it very nearly cost me the only piece of decency I've got left." He didn't shout. Men like that never shout. He just picked up the deed, folded it in half, and said, "Michaelmas is in 5 weeks, Mr. Ashby. I own her orchard, her cottage, and the lane you ride up. Think on what you've just spent, and remember it wasn't yours to spend." I walked out of that house into the cold with my heart going like a hammer, half sick and half laughing, and there was a man standing in the yard by my horse. Gray, 60 or near it. A good coat gone shabby at the cuffs, and the face of a man who had been on the road so long he'd stopped expecting to arrive. Behind him, in the inn yard across the way, stood that black carriage with the gold crest. "Mr. Ashby," he said, "forgive me. I've been 3 days finding a man who'd give me a straight answer in this town." "About what?" He reached into his coat. He brought out a small oval case and opened it and held it up. A miniature portrait. A young woman, perhaps 22 or 3. Dark hair pinned up, pearl at her throat, chin lifted just slightly, the way people do when they're trying not to smile for the painter. No scar, no mark on her at all, but I knew that face. I'd watched it check a yard before it was allowed to laugh. The ground went out from under me. "Her name," the man said, and his voice cracked on it, after 3 years of asking, "is Lady Eleanor Marchmont. She is the daughter of the Duke of Corvain, and I have looked for her in every town between here and the border." He turned the portrait toward the light. "Sir, have you seen her?" I said, "No." I looked a man who had spent 3 years on the road in the eye, and I lied to him. And the strange thing is, I don't regret that part. Not for a second. It wasn't mine to tell. She'd said my family are in the north. Don't press, and I'd promised her with my silence. And I kept it standing in a cold inn yard with my heart hammering. He put the portrait away. He looked so tired. "If you should hear anything," he said. "The Duke is not—" He stopped and started again. "He is not well. He does not sleep. He has crossed this country twice." Then he climbed into that black carriage, and it rolled off down the Thirsk road. And I stood there in the mud, and everything I thought I knew came apart. A duke's daughter. The woman who strained honey through 7-penny muslin. The woman a churchwarden robbed of threepence in front of a shop full of people. The woman my ex-wife stood up in front of 90 farmers and called the ugliest in town. A duke's daughter. Now listen to me carefully, because this next part is the worst thing I ever did, and I need you to see it properly. I did not want her money. I never gave the money one thought, and I never doubted her. Not for a heartbeat. What happened to me was smaller and more pathetic than that. I got on my horse to ride to Wicker's End, and I got as far as the crossroads at Kirkby, the same crossroads where I'd once turned back in the rain and done the right thing. And I looked down at myself. Borrowed coat, boots that had been resoled twice, a saddle with a mended girth, 14 shillings in the world, and a colt I hadn't finished breaking. And I thought, I cannot walk up that lane and ask a duke's daughter to marry a bankrupt. Not like this. Not with nothing in my hands. I'll go to her father first. I'll go to Corvain and stand in front of the man and ask for her properly. Like a man who came to the front door instead of creeping in at the back. I'll do it right. I'll do it with honor. That's what I told myself. But it wasn't honor. I know that now. It was the exact same pride that made me tell Marcus Vaunce I'd not be kept. The same pride that walked my mares out of my own yard. The same pride that couldn't look my wife in the face because looking meant admitting I'd failed. Pride. Wearing honor's coat. It always does. I turned north. 4 days on the road. Corvain is a great gray house at the end of an avenue of limes, so long you can't see the door from the gate. And I stood in a hall you could have put my whole farm inside. In my resoled boots, holding my hat. The Duke of Corvain came in. 60. Straight as a fence post. And behind the eyes, ruined. Absolutely ruined. The way a building can still be standing with nothing left inside it. I told him where she was. I told him she kept bees, and made salves, and that the town called her ugly, and she never once let them see it land. I told him I loved her and I had nothing. And I asked him, I actually asked, hat in hand, 33 years old, whether a man with nothing might be permitted to court his daughter. He listened to every word without moving. Then he said, "Thank you," and rang the bell, and I was shown out. He never answered the question. 3 days later I was back in Ashcombe, and so was that carriage. I came up the Kirkby Lane at noon, and the black carriage was standing at the gate of Wicker's End, with the horses steaming, and I got off my horse, and my legs didn't feel like mine. She was in the orchard, veil in one hand, smoker on the ground beside her, still breathing white, and her father was standing 6 feet away on the grass in a coat worth more than the cottage behind him, and I got there in time to hear him say the words he'd been rehearsing for 3 years. He said, "You will come home now. Not I looked for you every day. Not I never stopped. Not forgive me. You will come home now." And I watched her face close like a door. Then she saw me at the gate. I've been kicked by a horse. I've had bailiffs count my life out in front of me. Nothing in my life has ever been like standing at that gate, while she looked from her father, to me, to the mud on my horse from 4 days of the North Road, and worked it out. It took about 1 second. "You went to him," she said. "Nell, you went to him." She came across the grass. "Before you came to me, I wanted to do it properly. I wanted to come to you with something in my hands. I never asked for anything in your hands." And that was the only time in my life I heard her raise her voice. "Do you know what I asked for? I asked you not to press. And you didn't press. And then you went round me. You went 4 days north, and stood in a hall, and talked about me to the one man on this earth who has never once been able to look at me. I love you. I know." Her voice dropped, and that was so much worse. That's what makes it unbearable. Everyone I love decides what's best for me while I'm standing right there. She went into the cottage. She came back out with the salve jar. The little one, the first thing I ever bought from her, that I'd paid a shilling for so I'd have an excuse to come back. She put it in my hand and closed my fingers round it. "There," she said. "Now there's nothing of yours left in this house. They left in the morning. I know because I stood on the ridge above the Kirkby Road, in the dark, and watched the lamps of that carriage go south, and I stood there until I couldn't see them, and then a while after that, winter came down on Ashcombe like a lid. And here's the thing I did. The only thing in this whole story I'm proud of. I didn't follow her. Every day for 5 months I wanted to. Every single day, I saddled that horse in my head and rode to Corvain and stood in the Avenue of Limes and shouted her name until somebody came out. I didn't go, because I finally understood the thing I'd spent 33 years not understanding. That loving somebody does not entitle you to decide anything for them. She had been decided for by her father, and by the town, and by my ex-wife, and, the last time, the worst time, by me. So I let her be free of me. That was the only gift I had left, and it cost more than the farm. Instead, I worked. I took horses at half rate from every farmer Vance had ever offended, and it turns out that when a proud man in a warm room makes enemies for 20 years, they all remember. I worked that deaf bay colt every day, from his right side, hand flat, voice low and constant. And in February, Cecily came up my lane. She stood in my yard in her wedding clothes money, married 3 months, and she couldn't look at me. "I made a joke," she said, "at the harvest supper. You did. I wanted the town to stop pitying you." Her chin went up, then down. "Because every time they pitied you, it was a verdict on me. I couldn't bear it. So I made you a punchline, and I made her a punchline, and I told myself it was kindness." She pressed her lips together. "I wanted you to fail, Owen. I wanted it so I could stop feeling guilty for leaving. And I gave her the truth I'd never given anyone. 'The night you left,' I said, 'under everything, I was relieved.'" She flinched, "And I've hated myself for that for 2 years. But I'm not sorry for the relief, Cecily. I'm sorry for the 4 years before it, when I couldn't look at you, and made that relief the only thing left possible." She cried. I didn't comfort her, and she didn't want me to. Then she wiped her face and said, "She was the only person in that hall who wasn't pretending. I knew it when I said it. That's why I said it." And she walked out of my yard and out of my life, and we were square. Meanwhile, and I only learned this later, sitting at a kitchen table with her hand in mine. Nell was in a house with 200 rooms. They put her in silk, they put her in high collars, the fashionable kind, so the scar didn't show. And she sat at long tables full of people, night after night after night. And not one of them looked at her. Not with cruelty. That would have been something. They looked past her, smoothly, politely, the way you look past a chair. Ashcombe at least had the honesty to laugh. Corvain simply arranged its eyes so she wasn't in them. And one night in March, her father came into the small drawing room where she was sitting alone and stood by the fire for a long time, and finally said the true thing. He said, "I couldn't look at you." He said, "Because every mark on you is proof that you went back in for him." And I was in that yard. I was 40 feet from the kitchen door, with 2 good hands and 2 good legs, and I stood there and shouted. He said, "It was never disappointment in you, Eleanor. There has never been one moment of my life since that I have been able to look at my own hands." And a 3-year-old wound in both of them finally opened up and started to drain. Then she asked him one question. "Did a man come to you? In the autumn?" The Duke was quiet a long while. "He did." "What did he ask you for?" And her father said, "That's the thing I can't account for. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for a settlement. He looked into the fire. He asked me where your brother was buried. He said if anything ever happened to your bees, if the hives failed, if there was sickness in them, he wanted to know where to send you word, so you'd not hear it from a stranger." And Lady Eleanor Marchmont put down her cup and sat very still. Ashcombe Fair, the first Saturday in May. Sun on the grass, ribbons on the pens. Every farmer in the North Riding, leaning on a rail with a pipe, and the smell of trampled clover, and hot pastry and horse. And in the ring, a 2-year-old deaf bay, going sweet as milk. I'd worked him 8 months. He came off the leg. He stood at the block. He turned to face a voice with his whole body, and I ran him from the right side, and the men at the rail went quiet, the way farmers do when they see something done properly. A dealer from North Allerton offered me 22 guineas. Not a fortune, not the farm back, but it was mine, and I'd made it out of nothing but patience and being wrong and learning, and I took it. And I turned round to lead that colt out, and she was at the rail. No carriage, no silk, gray dress, collar open, the scar in full May sunshine, and the ruined left hand resting on the top rail, where every single person at that fair could see it. She'd come on the mail coach, alone. She'd been standing there, I found out later, for the better part of an hour. I couldn't move. "You should have come to me first," she said. "I know. Say why you didn't." "Because I was ashamed." My voice went. "Because I had nothing, and I dressed it up as honor. I've done that my whole life, Nell. I did it to your father, and I did it to Cecily, and I did it to my own farm. I'd like to stop." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you know what Corvain is like?" "No. 200 rooms, silk, servants who've known me since I was born." She turned her hand over on the rail, and not one person in that house looked at me. Not once. Not in 5 months. Not out of cruelty. Out of manners. They looked past me so beautifully I started to think I'd stopped existing. She stepped closer, and the entire time I was there, I kept thinking about a man in a borrowed coat who never once looked away. Not at the supper when 90 people did. Not by the fire when I showed you the worst night of my life and waited for you to flinch. Not once in 8 months, Owen, not one single time. And then she said it, quiet, so only I heard it, in the middle of Ashcombe Fair. The whole town looked at me. "You're the only one who ever saw me." I asked her to marry me right there, with the lead rope still in my hand, and hay in my cuffs, and a colt breathing down my neck. She said yes, before I'd finished the sentence, and I kissed her at that rail, in the sun, in front of the entire fair, in front of half the people who'd laughed at that harvest supper. Nobody laughed. There wasn't a sound in that whole field. A year on, Wicker's End, bought outright, not by a duke, and not by me alone, but by the 2 of us together, over 18 months of honey and horses and going without. 22 hives now along the south wall, and in the low stone wall at the end of the orchard, there's a gap, and set into that gap is a small carved stone with one word on it, Ambrose. I built it that way without asking her. She came out one morning and found it, and stood there so long I thought I'd done wrong. The Duke visits at Michaelmas. He sits in a kitchen chair that's far too small for him, in a cottage that would fit in his stable yard. And last autumn, my wife taught her father how to work a smoker. 61 years old, hands shaking, learning to breathe smoke slow into a hive so the bees would let him near. And that afternoon, Nell laughed at something I said. And I watched her, because I always watch her. She didn't check the room first. She just laughed, straight out, head back, into the open air, because she finally lived in a place where she never once had to ask permission to be happy. That's the whole story. That's everything. So let me leave you with this, and I want you to actually sit with it. There is somebody in your life right now that everybody looks at, and nobody looks at properly. The one they've quietly agreed isn't worth much. The one who gets the change counted short and says thank you anyway. Here's my question for you. How many people have walked past you in your life, and how many have you walked past? Because you were both too busy looking at the scar to ever see the person carrying it. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And listen, if you are the one in the gray dress at the end of the third table tonight, if you're the one they laughed at, the one nobody chose, the one sitting with a scar the world decided to make your whole name, hear me. You are not too damaged. You are not too late. And you are not too much, or too little, or too far gone. Your worth was never up for a vote. The room does not get to decide. The town does not get to decide. The people who looked away were never qualified to judge, and their laughter tells you everything about them and absolutely nothing about you. Keep your collar open. Keep walking the length of that hall slow as Sunday. Keep doing your work well. Keep your heart soft even when it's expensive, because one day somebody is going to walk into your life, and out of a room of 90 people who looked away, they will be the one who never stopped looking. And when they do, you'll know why you survived every single thing you survived to get there. If this story moved you even a little, subscribe and tap that notification bell, because the next story is one you'll want to hear the moment it drops. Thank you for watching. Go be the one who sees people.